Hello and welcome to another Witcher 3 REDkit guide. Today we're going to talk about how to create simple quests, where we're going to take a look at how to create the tools or how to use the tools to create the overall structure of the quest and the building components of it. So these tools will be using the quest graph editor, which is essentially a node editor that can be used to basically construct the overall flow and logic of the quest. And also we will take a look at the journal editor, which is a tool mainly used for creating journal entries, which will be used as the building components of your quest. And today I think one of the most common quests and the simple ones would be the Witcher contracts, or more likely Monster Hunter quests. So without any further ado, let's jump straight in. I'm just going to launch REDkit. Let's create a new project. So for here, I'm just going to name my project tutorial quest, and I will just quickly get a location for it. So new folder will be tutorial quest. You can name it anything as you want. It really doesn't matter as long as it makes sense to you. All right, hit on create new project. And let's wait for a few seconds to let the editor actually initialize some things in the background. All right, and we are inside. So as you can see, the main viewport. I'm not going to, repeat myself from the other tutorials. You probably already know how the main viewport and some of the tools work and like the scene structure and stuff. So I'm just going to save time and not repeat all of this basic stuff to you. If you're interested, you can check out the world creation tutorial where we talked about more about the overall usage of the scene panel and layers and stuff. Also, I'm not going to create a new world. I think we can, the basic context of this quest would be perfect if we would just start it from the Blood and Wine quest graph. So quests are essentially assets that you can reach for in the asset browser. You can open the asset browser by using this icon on the main toolbar. And there you have it. In the asset browser, you will see at the left side, this arrow can actually show the tree of your assets. And in here, you can actually see that there's a folder called quests. And inside, you can see the basic structure of the whole quests and like the quests and phases that are mainly used for the main game, so the base Witcher 3 game. And in here, you will probably see some quest files and phases. So what are phases? It's basically sub parts of a quest. You can either create, a quest file that will be a huge node editor, where all the connections between the nodes will be stated and it will basically build up the quest. But of course, you can separate these sub-graphs into phases. And that's why these phases are pretty useful, because that way you can actually reuse them in multiple quests, for example. So you don't have to redo all the commonly used stuff, which is pretty neat. So these phases can be actually referenced. We will talk about this in a bit. And of course, you will most likely have quest files. If you take a look at the root folder, for example, you will see that quest files like this will exist in a lot of parts of this sub-junction. And in here, you can see that the main quest, that is basically the whole base Witcher 3 game, and its structure is located inside in this Witcher 3 quest. If you double click on it, you will actually see that it will open a editor for us called Quest Editor. And this tool is basically going to be responsible for, at the right panel, it will show us the overall structure of the nodes, of different nodes and how they are used to actually construct the quest. And yeah, let's talk about how we can actually like use it and how shall we navigate between it. So most of the time, the two most important panels is the right side, where you can actually see the nodes and its connections. And at the left panel is pretty important to actually see the currently selected nodes and its properties. So by left clicking on nodes, you can actually highlight them, and the highlighted node or the selected node's properties will always show up in this side. Of course, you can use selection boxes like so to highlight and, select more than just one. Of course, the properties will not likely show us because you can only show the clear context of one node at a time. And yeah, moving components is pretty much the same as you would suspect from other editors such as this. So you can just, use your mouse and left mouse button to actually drag things around. And also you can do this with multiple elements as well. So one thing that you actually have noticed that I could actually navigate inside these nodes, I basically use the double click action onto this node to actually get inside of its context. So these nodes are actually called phase nodes. They are basically used for hiding implicit content so that you can keep your graph a little bit more easy to understand. Layer by layer, you can go get inside in these phases and actually see what they are hiding. And that way you can actually keep your graph a little bit cleaner. Now, these phase nodes are pretty much strongly related to the phase files that we have watched earlier. So these phases can actually be saved into separate files. So you can reuse them, and later in these phase nodes, you can reference them by using this phase field. So as you can see, this prologue phase is actually using up a prologue.v2 phase file. If you're using this magnifier icon, you can actually locate it in the asset browser itself. So that's pretty neat. Okay. And yeah, so navigating is between the layers. You can just double click on the actual faces to get inside. At the top left corner, you will see that how deep inside you are in the graph. As you can see, we are currently on the third level because I opened two faces. And if you want to navigate to the upper level, so you want to go back to the parent layer, then you can just double click on the background and you will see that right now we're at the second level, and if I double clicking again, we're at the top level again. So I think that's basically the very basics of using or navigating inside this editor. So let's talk about the types of nodes that you can use in a brief. So as you can see, these arrows are used for inputs and outputs. They are the representative for even the quest file has a different one. So the very quest file, the very, very top level, has a start and an end pin. And this is pretty useful for phases as well. So as you can see, this phase can also define an input, different inputs, and the phase itself has this input called prologue. So for that, you can just actually use the context menu to create nodes. Creating nodes, you can just right click at the background and you will see a huge context menu stating every groups of nodes that you can use at your proposal. And for complexity management, you will see that you can actually add more inputs and outputs, and more importantly, the phases. So one thing is the flow, actually. So the overall execution of quests and their logic will be represented by these connections. So once you get the signal from the input, you will see that the input will go through the connections and then straightforward to the other subgroups and subnodes that they are connected to. These can also be parallel. And of course, the nodes that are connected in series will be executed one by one from left to right. And one important thing that you can we can discuss that you can, define any number of inputs that you want. For example, you can see that this consylum in is used in this purpose. And if you right click at the node, you can actually see that sometimes all the inputs and outputs are not always visible for these phases, because you have this option called hide unused sockets that will just show the used inputs and outputs, and everything else will be hidden away. But if you see that there's this show all sockets button, that way you can actually reveal every socket that the current node has. Okay, and so these hexagons are one of the most commonly used nodes that you will see in the graphs, and they are basically used for pausing the execution. So as you can see in this input, as the signal will get into this hexagon, this is actually will pause the execution and look out for a condition defined in here. And the execution, it won't let the execution go past to it until the condition hasn't met. So once the condition is true, then it will go through the hexagons, which is pretty neat, because that way you can actually handle conditions in your quests. You will see other stuff like initiating or start to play some mechanics like playing scenes. Also, you have another type of conditions that can actually handle both of the outputs, let it be true or false or anything that would be logical to you. And also, we have scripts as well, which is pretty common. So as you might have suspect, these scripts are actually the red scripts. So these script nodes can actually reference all the red scripts that you can define. Mainly these are function calls that you can call from the quest, which is also, it's useful because that way you can customize the work or the use of your quest even more if you want to delve into it. And I think these are the most commonly used nodes. And maybe we can just talk 1 minute about the FactDB. So facts are basically globally accessible variables where you can use this node called factsDB change. And what this node actually does is that you can define a variable, and the name can be anything as long as it's unique. And once you define a value to it, it will be saved to a database called factsDB. And that way you can later on, in any context, in any other layer, even maybe in an entirely different phase, you can just call or check this fact that was previously defined. And that way you can just actually use it for conditions or anything else that would, happen much later than the actual setting or setter of this factDB change. I think that's pretty much it for the commonly used one. So let's start to create our quest. For us, I think it would be great to actually start the quest maybe at the beginning of the Blood and Wine quests. So as I said, in here, everything is located that's basically for the vanilla quest. But for DLCs, we have the same structure located for each DLC inside of their folder. So for Bob is actually used for the Blood and Wines, and inside data you will see that the same structure will basically be found like the one that you see at the root tree. But this time only the assets that are modified or that are somewhat new for the DLC will be present in these folders. So inside you will find the quests. You can also use the asset browser list view if that's more convenient for you. And in here, you will see this Bob quest v2 quest file, which can be also opened. And there you have it. This is the very graph of the whole Blood and Wine quest and all of the side quests and everything that's basically in the DLC itself. So I think it would be great if we could actually start it right away when the Blood and Wine DLC initiates. So I'm just going to, create our quest inside of the root layer. But first, of course, we need to define some journal entries that will be, as I said, the building blocks of our quest. So for that, we're going to use another tool called Journal Editor. So in Tools, Journal Editor, you can open it. And in here, you will see all the journal entries that are separated in numerous categories. So these journal entries are not just used for defining quest parts, but also it's defining glossary parts or the different characters that can be most likely visible in some quest descriptions or the glossary itself in the characters section. But right now we want to focus on creating a quest. And you can see that the same structure that we have seen in the asset browser, in the vanilla contents, and also the DLCs are located here, as you can see. So everything is located inside of here, and these are groups. So let's say that we want to create a new side quest, then we can just hop on over on the side quest side, and each quest entry is basically responsible for holding a quest and its phases and objectives. So a quest can mainly contain descriptions, which is basically, applying additional information and context that the player can read when the journal editor opens. At the right side, you probably remember that there's a description for each quest if you select it in the game. So for these are actually responsible for adding that text and description for the quest. And of course, the phases. So if you let's say that you have a huge quest that has numerous chapters, then it would make sense to create phases for it. And these are also represented by this folder icon. And, you can also edit an existing quest if that's something that you fancy. For that, you need to check out the actual content. So you will see that right now everything is disabled and not so highlighted. So you have to first check out to actually edit the contents. But right now, we just want to check out the whole side quests and create a new quest right away. And as you can see, you will see that a new item has appeared at the bottom. And here we can finally start creating the components. So for the quest, you need to define some fields in here, and some of them are optional. So I'm just going to through them one by one. So file name is just simply the file that will be somewhere located in your journal entries. And for your journal entries, you can locate them in the gameplay journal section of your asset browser. And in here, you will see the same structure as this tree actually shows us. And inside of that structure folders, you will see that these are the journal entries that are essentially file assets that can also be located inside of your asset browser. So for that, we're just going to create some file name or define a file name for it. You cannot use spaces or white spaces for that because it's a file name. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. Let's go something unique. So the editor name is just essentially, the name that will show up in the tree. It's not that important. Let's just do this. And the unique script tag is essentially some unique identifier that will help some background mechanics, identify your journal entries. So it's just a unique ID. For that, you can either use the tools and generate it automatically by using this tool option, or just type something that would most likely, be unique and most likely not collide with anything else. So for that, I'm just going to use this method. And and in the type, so quest can be separated to treat it as a story, a chapter, a side, a monster hunt, or a treasure hunt. For now, for simplicity's sake, you can either use the monster hunt, but I'm just going to stick around and use the side type. Click on yes. And the content type is basically whether it's a vanilla game or it's supposed to be a quest of one of the DLCs. So since we're using the Blood and Wine DLC, we're just going to use this EP2 option. And the world is something that we also used for. When you open the journal, you will actually see all of the unique flags of different worlds. So this option is actually used for stating in which world your quest is located. So for us, well, we will start at Novigrad. You might think that it's actually in the Blood and Wine quest graph, but essentially Blood and Wine starts in Novigrad first. So we will just use Novigrad, but you can use anything else. It really doesn't matter. So hunt creature, if we would have, a very unique creature that the player would face first, then you can use this hunt creature reference, which will actually open the journal entries for all of the creatures that can be found in the game. And you can use them and double click on some journal entry of a monster to actually use it as a reference. But this time we don't really have any unique monster at disposal. We just want to do some simple quest. And the title will be actually the string used for the GUI. When the player plays the game, the title field is actually going to show the title of the quest. So this is something that's probably important. So let's call it tutorial quest demo. And you will see that there's also a select button in here. So since this is a string that's actually used for all the locals in the game, it's strongly tied to the string database itself. So once you hand type your text and click on save, it will be saved into the database as well. The string database that's already located in your project folder once you create it. And another method that you can add value to this title field, or any field that's basically a string that's used up by the gameplay. You have this select option that will open up a dialog, and in this dialog you can actually search strings that are already saved in the string database. So let's say that you have already saved some texts and like strings that you want to use for your quest. Then the database first approaches for you. Then I guess you could just apply some filters, type in to search for the actual text, press enter, and you can select the search results and click on OK. And that way you can also give value to this. Also, you can, you can search for search keys as well, which is neat. But this time we will just type something in here because we don't really have anything already saved in the database. So let's go on the descriptions. In here, this is just a collection, but maybe we can give a unique script tag first. Okay. And create new description. And in here, we will state the name of it. Let's call it start. And start desk 1 for unique script tag. And since it's a string as well that can be huge, you can also, yet again, use this select option to apply some already saved string from the database. But this time we don't have anything. I'm just going to type something in here. Something like that. Okay, I think that's pretty good for our descriptions. One other important thing is the actual phase, and each phase will contain a set of objectives that are actually needed to be completed to actually complete the whole quest. So for that, I'm just going to create a new phase and give it a name. Like so. And inside of this, you can actually see that if you right click, you can create a new objective inside. And in here, I'm just going to state the name. Sorry, it will be an objective this time. We can use the same, I think, for the Unix script tag. The description is the actual objective name or the state of the objective that will show up in the game. So let's do something like kill the monster, like so. Okay. And you can define any objectives like with the same method as long as you use this context menu. And I think for the simplicity's sake, we can just use one objective at a time. So I'm just going to use this one. All right. And in these fields, you can actually, so we define the description. You can set some images that will probably, initiate inside of the glossary or somewhere in the description itself. I rarely use this, but it's optional, so it's not necessary to use. One of the thing is the world. So in here, you can actually, define or get a reference to another world instance. So let's say that you have a huge quest that will start in Novigrad, but will end somewhere in Skellige or in another world, entirely another world. You can do that, but in that way, you can actually make sure that the objectives that will reside in another world can be set to another world. But this time we will just stick to Novigrad, so we can use the default inherit from parent option. In here, we can use a counter, and we can set the type, and everything under it is basically for the counter itself. So each objective, can be treated as a go fetch objective where you would either kill a number of individuals, bandits, or like monsters, or you need to collect some items or ingredients. That's why counters are used or pretty good for, because you can define either to kill something and give the number for it. The mutually exclusive boolean will set whether you want to kill one thing out of 4. So that's one thing that you can use. But if you need the player to kill all the 4 individuals like bandits, then you don't need to use this mutually exclusive boolean. And of course, you can set references to the very instances of the items or killable monsters or recipes that the counter is tried to reference to. So if you want to say that, hey, I want to kill in this quest or objective, I want to kill 4 monsters, then you would set it to 4. And in here, you will get a monster path that's basically, used for stating that you need to, kill 4 insectoids and so on. So only one at a time, I think, would make sense to set. But this time, we're just going to say that you need to kill some monster. We are not certain what it is, so we're just going to leave these open for now. Okay, so if you take a look at the left, you will see that the newly created journal entries are actually highlighted with a different color. And the reason for that, the editor tries to warn us that this content is not yet saved and added to source control. So let's make sure that first we want to save and add to source control option. And another thing is to save and check in. And that way it will refresh the actual structure, the journal structure. And after that point, you can actually reference the newly created items from inside another tool like the quest graph. So let's just save and check in. And you will see that now they are no longer highlighted, so we can use them. We can either close the journal editor or just leave it on just minimize it, since you're probably going to, go back at it and reuse it every now and then. So in here, what we can do is to actually reference these using the journal and the quest nodes. And of course, we need to first check out the Blood and Wine quest graph for addition. All right, and as you can see now, a quest node has appeared. So quest nodes have different inputs. Only one input would be used, because as you can see, one is used for activation of a quest, deactivating one, make it succeed and failure. And these quest nodes can actually reference different, layers of your quest. Let it be the root entry of your quest or some description or the objective. You can use the very same node for all of them. So if you want to activate the quest, for instance, and nothing else, you could just go over, as you can see in this quest entry property, the same tree structure just appeared for us. And here you can just navigate yourself and you will see that this quest tutorial 01 is now here and can be found. By double clicking on it, you can actually set the property of it. You can see that the title of the node will be changed once that's done. The other properties are basically used for, so show info on screen is used for actually showing the quest that it's now active once, the player has it. So at the left side, the GUI will state us that, hey, this quest is now available for us. So this boolean can make sure that this will happen. The track it's used for basically automatically tracking the quest. So forcing the game to make it as the most prior. So the tracked quest. And you can also auto save the game once the quest initiates, which is also good. So you can, just use the sockets. If you left click on the socket, keep holding the left mouse button and drag the connection. You can actually drag the connection to these inputs, as you can see. But first, let's just prepare something in the level as well. So let's open up the Novigrad world. And it will probably take some time because it's, the larger the level gets that you want to open, the more time it needs to load in, because Novigrad is quite large. Because essentially every asset and layer and group that's used for its scene structure needs to be loaded. And by default, nothing gets loaded into the main viewport itself. You have to manually, check. And at the root node, you can either load in everything, and I mean everything that's currently stated in the level in any context and in any distance. You can use the load all in group, but it probably may take some time. So one thing that can be done, that you can, just state one of the groups and select load all in group, and it will only load that group or that layer. Or another useful method is that you can actually load in all the layers that are in a range of your currently used camera. So you can state a certain radius, and in that radius, everything will be loaded in, and outside of that radius, things are going to be left out, which is pretty neat. So if you hop on over in the view toolbar menu and say load layers around camera, you can actually set the very range. And by clicking OK, it will load all the layers that are in proximity. Okay, so let's create a new layer for our quest. Well, everything is loaded in. That's essentially necessary. So you can see that there are a bunch of debug stuff activated. You can actually set these debug filters inside of these settings. And in editor options debug, you can actually set all the debug filters that are currently present. So you can see that waypoints are checked in. These are tube thingies that you can see right now. But if I uncheck it, then everything will be removed. But since we want to use this waypoint filter later on, I think I'm just going to leave it as is. So let's say that I want to have a trigger area. And once the player is inside of that trigger area, the quest will initiate right away, which is a pretty simple way to actually start a quest. So for that, we're just going to create a layer that will be strictly dedicated to the contents of the quest. For that, we could actually just, select some of the group and, select the village or location that would be, make sense to you. or just simply, create a root layer right at the top level. And for that, either way, you just need to right click and select add layer, name it to something that would make sense and unique. All right. And for the type, since we have a lot of dynamic entities like monsters and investigation and stuff, we're just going to use the non-static for dynamic entities. And for build deck, since it's used for a quest, just select quest. Okay. So now we have this layer right at the bottom, and it's already highlighted and activated. So we can right away go and start to create our trigger area inside gameplay area, trigger area. And this is pretty neat to actually, it's used for, checking whether the player or anything else is crossing its boundaries. I just actually using the scale option for the gizmo to actually scale it. You can also toggle these options like move, rotate, scale by pressing the spacebar. And, just scale it a little bit on the Z axis and maybe move it a little bit downward like so. Scale it a little bit bigger. Yeah, I think that's perfect. Okay. One other thing is that we want to actually reference this trigger area from inside the quest graph. And for that, we're going to use the tags essentially. So tags are located for each selected item. So I'm having this quest trigger area selected. And once it's selected, you can actually see the properties right here. Or maybe on the tabs on the right, you can just actually drag and relocate these tabs as you would see it fit. So let's state the name of this tag called tutorial trigger 1. And that's one more important thing, that we not only need to set the tags for the C node, but for actually the other components as well. So most of the time, objects have two tags references, either for its component or the object itself. And you can make sure that this tag reference will work if you set both of them. So let's save it, save the level as is. Right. And also what we want to do is to actually create a spawner or a spawn waypoint for the monster to show up on. So for that, we're going to use the gameplay spawn point and add spawn point. And since we have this waypoint debug filter selected, we can see it. And then here, we need to do the same. We need to apply a tag to it so we can later reference it in the quest graph. So let's call it monster spawn 1. Or maybe just a little bit more unique, tutorial monster spawn. I'm just going to copy it and paste it in here as well. Let's save. Okay. And getting back to the quest graph itself, let's use a condition that will make sure that the quest will initiate once the player gets inside of the trigger area. And for that, we can use the flow control, which is actually the signal or execution flow. And here we can use this pause nodes, which will look like hexagons. And in here, once I select it, I can define one or more conditions inside of the conditions array. By using this plus arrow, I could just actually append the conditions list. And once I have a condition in here, you can see this down facing arrow or downward arrow. I'm just going to click in here, and in this selector dialog, I can just search for the different conditions that we can use. Everything is in here, and even they are toggleable, and they will reveal more and more conditions. And at the bottom, you can actually search for one. So let's search for trigger, and we can actually have two triggers for entering or, checking if the instance is inside of a trigger area. For now, enter trigger is perfect for us. Let's rename it player enters. And by default, the player entity or the player instance has an already defined tag that we can use, and it's called player, uppercase. But for the trigger area, we needed to define that for ourselves. So let's check what was it again. I think it was, oops. And just select it, and you will see that it's tutorial trigger 1. I'm just gonna copy it and paste it in here, like so. Okay. And that's pretty much it for the condition of triggers. Let's connect this. So right away, it will check whether the player is inside of the trigger or not. And if it's true, then we can activate our quest, like so. Perfect. And let's make sure that, yeah, the information will be shown on the screen once it activates. Okay, another thing before we try this out is to actually define a community that will be used to actually spawn our monsters. So communities are basically, well, a huge table or a list of elements for all the instances that can be spawned. And they are not strictly related to locations. So you can actually reuse these communities for different contexts. So you don't have to, define different community for each kind of, monster or NPC that you want to spawn. You can reuse them. So let's create one. I think you can create it anywhere what would make sense to you. Either if you want, you have a custom level, then maybe inside of its folders, you can create one. But this time I'm just going to create it in the quests. In here, create community. And let's call it tutorial monster, like so. And by double clicking it, it will open its editor, which is, well, basically it looks like a huge table. And you will see at the top that there are two tabs. One of them is actually called timetables. This is an optional way to actually define in what daytimes or what day cycles you want to spawn different stuff, because this table can, contain a huge amount of, or a huge list of different NPCs or monsters or characters. And each row of this table will define a different way to spawn it, a different time, a quantity, location, and pretty much any basic information that is needed for the spawn. And that is why these communities are pretty useful, because we don't have to create a community each time we want to spawn something in a really, well, a little different way. We just need to make sure that we append this list, and it's going to be used as is. And for timetables, these are optional. Right now, we just want to make sure that this monster will be spawned and it will be initiated from the quest graph. So let's add an element. Inside of this, you can see that we need to add element for each section, because these sections can be repeated as well, column by column. And for the entity template, we need the reference. We need a reference for the monster that we will use. For that, hop on the characters on the asset browser, NPC entities, and monsters. And in here, let's open up the image so we can see the previews. All right. And let's use a goal, for example, a pretty simple monster. And by left clicking on it, I just selected it, and the currently selected item will be copied, but the reference of it will be copied to this cell by using this left arrow. So once I do this and click outside the cell, you can see that the reference is now pasted in. The entity spawn tags are pretty much the way how we actually define tags for the trigger areas. But of course, the monsters won't spawn right away. So this field is actually making sure that once it gets spawned, it will use the tags that we define in here. So let's call this tutorial monster goal one, something that's unique for it. Okay. And these, a lot of options like the mapping tag and initialize can be used, but it's not necessary, it's not obligatory to use it. For now, we just want to make sure we want to use the very basic stuff to actually just, make sure that the monster will spawn. And in the story phase name, so as I said, multiple contexts can be defined and for the same monster as well, or the same entity. But you can define different story phases, which will, make sure that in the quest graph, you can select these phases. And from different nodes using different phases, you can actually define what state or what combination of these elements will be used. And this story phase is one thing that's mainly used for referencing that row of this community. Of course, you can use the default phase or name it anything that you would make sense out of. And the quantity can left as is. The initializers is not necessary either. So we only want one monster, so the quantity is perfect. And the spawn point is actually the place where it will be spawned. So as you remember, we place this node right here for that very purpose. And we can just copy this value for the tag and make sure that the community references that in the spawn point text field. So I'm just going to copy it here. If it will let me. Okay, it lets me. Perfect. And I think that's pretty much it. Let's save it. Make sure that you save the community once you're done editing it. And let's build the quest graph a little further to actually make sure that the monster will spawn in. So you can do it either parallelly or make it serial. So I'm just going to make sure that the description and the objective will be activated. For that, I'm just going to use this quest, like so. Quest, you can search the journal entry that you created for the description of the tutorial quest. By toggling it, descriptions, and double click on start. That way it will state the description as well. And most importantly, we want the objective to show up as well. So let's go on quest, side quests, quest tutorial phase, and the objective, like so. And as you can see, most of these pins are left out, so you can just hide the unused sockets, and that way it will be a little bit more clear to read maybe. So I just make this hidden. Also, I want to have another condition to actually check, or sorry, we don't need a condition. I just press Ctrl Z to actually, delete stuff. Also, you can delete stuff, but that way deletion markers will appear. You can also use the cut tool or this brush tool to, get rid of the unused nodes that you want to have. Okay, so we want to spawn in the monster. For that, we need gameplay and story phase setter. And story phase states the phase that we defined in the community itself. So in here, maybe, no, sorry, that's the spawn, but here. So story phase name default. Okay, so let's connect this. And the story phase setters are actually going to reference the communities by either activating a story phase or deactivating it. So activating a story phase will actually reference the community file that we just created. So if we go back to a previous tab, we will see that this is the community that we're using. Make sure that you select it in the asset browser, and the same way as we did previously, we just used this left pointing arrow. And that way you can see that the reference was pasted in. And this selection is actually the story phases that we discussed before. So it will list all the story phases that you have defined inside of this community file. Right now, we only have the default phase. So we're just going to select that. Okay, let's save. Okay, one important detail. So if you press save all, it will not only save everything on the current layer, but everything that's in all layers. So every node that's in the quest graph will be saved, and it will probably take some time if you have a huge quest graph to work on. If you just want to make sure that, you just want to save the newly added elements on the current layer that you're like residing in, that you can just simply use the save instead of save all. Right? You can add comments, by the way, to the nodes or rename them. But adding comments like monster spawn will also help probably, and you can see that the comment is shown at the top. All right, let's check that the monster is actually present after spawning, and then we can make sure that we want to check that the monster is killed or not. So first, let's check whether it's spawned in. For that, we need a condition called presence. Yeah, text presence condition, whether the monster is present or not. Spawned. And for the tags, we're going to use the tag that we defined in the community. So once the monster spawns in, it will have this tag. So we need to copy this and reference it here, that this monster will be present. And everything can be left as is because we only need one monster and that's all. Right. Okay. Another thing is to actually have another condition that will just, simply check whether the monster is dead or not. For that, we can use actor state conditions. So for that, I'm just going to search for, it's actually at the top. So it's quest actor condition. So an actor can actually be in numerous conditions. And for us, we need the check type of is alive. And we can, invert these conditions. So the opposite of being alive is dead. So that's what we want. Is monster dead? Perfect. Let's save it. And, once the monster is dead, we don't want to have any extra fancy detail this time. We just want to make sure that the quest completes. For that, we can only need to succeed the very root of the quest, and that way you can actually make every objective succeed. So you don't have to, individually go through objective by objective. You just need to succeed the quest, and that's that. For that, we need to select the root journal entry for the quest. Side quests. All right, quest tutorial. And yeah, that's it, just the root node. All right, make it succeed and hide everything else. One more thing to look out for: once you create the phases, just make sure that you have at least one connection to the outputs. So as you can see, that this graph actually using something from the output. So make sure that, in the phase, you don't forget to use it, because regardless of, connecting the output, you will not get anything out of it, even though you connected it outside, but there's no connection to the output. I'm just going to show you another example of this. So let's set up to send, and you will see that this out is actually connected here. If this connection would not exist, then regardless of, having it connected at the outside, you wouldn't have the actual, flow of it. So just make sure that happens. That's a small note. All right, let's save this. Save the community just to make sure. And now we just need a game definition file to actually launch the game to test the quest. So at the right side or the top side of the toolbar, you will see all kinds of joysticks. One is used for loading a save file, which is also good, or just play the current state that we like seeing currently at the main viewport. So if you just want to hop in right at this point and this location, you can use this play game on current layers only. But be aware that not all background functionalities will work as you would suspect, like quests or behaviors or anything like that will not necessarily work. To make sure that we actually start the game from the context where the quest will start, we can use game definition files. So if you hop on over on the quest or maybe the DLC quest collection, you will more likely see game definitions files located next to these quests. So if we go back to the DLC Bob data quest, you can see this joystick looking red game files, which are pretty much used for the same purpose. So for testing out the Bob quest or to start the quest in the gameplay from inside the editor, you can use this pop tech dev red game file. Having it selected, you can append this list for all the currently used red game files and just hit on the arrow to actually append this list with the selected red game file. And once you hit on this play game from definition joystick icon, it will start the game inside the editor from that very context. And you would probably wonder, maybe we can not show it because, the UI will be forced to focus on the game once it's loading. But as soon as I get the chance, I will show you how a game definition can be edited. So let's just wait for a minute because Novigrad is a pretty big level. Right, now we got back our asset browser in context. If you left click in the main viewport, you can actually start the gameplay. So as you can see, a lot of stuff is happening right now since we have different debug filters for the game, but you can get rid of them in settings. And in here, game debug and select none. But this will be permanent, which is a more convenient way maybe, is to actually use this brush icon on the top toolbar. You will see that the tooltip will state that this can clear debug stuff. And that way you can see that it's actually toggleable. So it's not permanent. You just have to toggle it like a switch. Okay. So as you might remember, and if we check, there's supposed to be the area that we put in previously. So let's wait for the tutorial to get done and also the quest of the main Blood and Wine DLC. But once these are finished to show on our screen, we can actually approach the trigger area. You can see at the left that we have the title of the quest appearing. Once I approach the trigger area and got inside of it, it initiated itself. We can already see in the background that there's the monster that we spawned. And if we open up the journal editor, we can see that there's a secondary quest now available called Tutorial Quest Demo. Here's the objective. Since we stated that this is a Blood and Wine EP2 quest, then here's the banner for Blood and Wine. And you can see that the description that we applied for it will, be appended to the right side. So let's get back into the gameplay and get rid of the monster. For now, I'm just going to use this command method called kill all, and that way I just got sure that it was killed. All right. And it's still active. Maybe I missed some detail. By pressing F10 on your keyboard, you can actually stop the gameplay and get back to edit mode. This can also take some time based on the amount of content that you have loaded in while playing the game. but this wouldn't take that long. Okay. So going back to the quest graph, we check that it's present. Oh yeah, okay, I forgot to add the actor tag, which is the monster. So it didn't know what to look out for, like what instance supposed to be dead or not. File, save. And before I get back to actually, checking the game once again, we can also make sure that it will show the quest succeeding. And for investigation, I guess we could use another extra little neat entity called footprints or focus clue. If we search for this, probably gonna see some results that we can use for the quest. So focus clue, go to resource home to actually see where it's actually located. So it's in the reference level, but this is not what I meant. Okay, maybe this one is the one that I'm trying to search for. Yeah, okay, so focus mode clues is actually one that you can, the game uses them to actually use your richer senses to track some scent or footprints or maybe sometimes dead NPCs and such. All of these are already located as templates because they are commonly used. So you don't have to, create an entity for yourself necessarily. If you want some basic stuff like, I don't know, footprints, then we could probably have some as well. Maybe it's here. We have blood splatter. That's also good. Animated clues. Maybe use blood splatter then. Blood path or blood splat. Let's go with blood splat 2. So having the item selected and having the layer activated, I can just drag and drop this and it will show up in the screen. These clues can also be interactable if you select it, because it's a blood and it's in the ground, it's barely visible, but it's there. So if you have the properties at the right side, having this clue selected, you can actually see that we can make this interactable by activating this is interactive boolean at the v3 master clue component. And also you can define the interaction animation. So whether the Geralt, when it interacts with it, what animation shall be played. You can leave it as none by default, but you can have a lot of things at your disposal, like smelling it or inspecting it. So maybe we should see the examine ground. So Geralt will actually crouch while examining this blood splatter. And you can just copy paste this and use numerous instances of the same entity to achieve a bigger investigation scene. But for now, I think it's enough. Let's save this. Okay, so examine ground was saved and also it's interactable. I just wanted to make sure. So we're going to initiate the game definition once again. Okay, so once again, we are inside finally. Get rid of the tutorials. Once we see the trigger area, we can actually probably can get rid of the debug filters, like so. Right. Just wait for the new quest notification to disappear. All right, let's approach the trigger area. The tutorial demo quest appears. We have a clue, like a blood splatter in here, and we can examine it as well. By pressing E, we can actually see that the animation is played, that examine ground, which we wanted. You can also define a scene, like a one-liner scene in the quest graph to actually, make Geralt say something while it's interacting with the environment or these blood splatters. So for that, you need to use scene nodes. But for that, I think we should, talk more about this in the scene tutorials. But for now, it's examinable, and you can see that the monster is right there. Let's approach it and try to kill it. Like so. All right. And okay, perfect. So we completed the quest as well. And you can see that the objective is completed, so we didn't need to individually do that. And we can loot the monster. Perfect. Okay, I think that's pretty much enough for just showing the very basics of how to create a quest. Of course, you can make like more complicated ones as you learn your way around using these tools. But this time I just wanted to make sure that you get the very basics of it and the overall workflow of them. So I hope you enjoy this. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. And without any further ado, thank you for watching, guys. See ya.